Good evening, everyone. My name is Scott Bradley. I am the Executive Director of your Thunder Bay Museum. Thank you to everyone who's joining us in person and on Zoom this evening. I would like to begin tonight by acknowledging the original custodians of this land and pay my respects to the elders, past, present, and future, for they hold the memories, the traditions, the culture, and the hopes of Indigenous peoples. We also recognize that we are meeting on the traditional land of Fort William First Nation, signatory to the Robinson Superior Treaty of 1850, and to acknowledge the role of the Métis settlement in the development of our community. So a bit of housekeeping, if this is your first time in the museum, there is a restroom just outside of that main door on the right, and there are additional restrooms down on the second floor. This lecture is being recorded, so if you do have a mobile device with you, we ask that you try to silence it. And for those of you joining us online, we should not be able to hear you or see you during the presentation. There will be refreshments tonight. They'll be brought up partway through the lecture, so please do stay afterwards to enjoy those. We'll also have time after the presentations for questions and answers. Tonight's lecture is in partnership with Lakehead University's Department of History and is presented by two graduate students from that department. Tonight's topics explore truths we need to understand to be a better society in the future. Some of what we hear tonight may be hard to process at first, but we will all be better for the knowledge. But it is through the continuing work like that presented tonight by the speakers that improves our historical narrative and that we can move forward to a future that we all want to be part of. Our first speaker is Haileigh Riddell. And her topic is going to be, as you can see on the screen, Eugenics, a comparison of Ontario and Alberta while examining the connection to Northwestern Ontario. Haileigh is currently pursuing her MA in History at Lakehead University and holds an HBA in History with a minor in Criminology at Lakehead. She is also a Canada Graduate Scholarship recipient through the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council. Her MA research examines settler-colonial health interactions. She is focusing on eugenics in Canada with a specific interest in Ontario and Alberta. So without further ado, Haileigh.
Alrighty, well, thank you, Scott. Hi, everyone. I hope you're doing well, and thank you for taking the time to come out tonight and for everyone tuning in online. Like Scott said, my name is Haileigh Riddell, and I'm here to talk a little bit about the research that I'm doing for my master's degree. So today I'm going to discuss the eugenics movement in Canada, focusing on comparing Ontario and Alberta through the Eugenics Society of Canada and the Alberta Eugenics Board. I'm also going to discuss a brief connection to Northwestern Ontario. So before I begin, I just wanted to provide a warning on the content and some of the offensive language that emerges in my presentation. Discussing the topic of eugenics comes with a wide range of issues, including navigating discussions on sexual sterilization and the categorization of individuals within the eugenics movement. I want to clarify that the terminology used is solely used in its historical context, as without it, the truth of the matter is not fully revealed. Although I have tried to be cautious, if the content becomes too much at any point, please feel free to take a moment and return when you feel comfortable. So, with that being said, I would like to first discuss some of the existing literature surrounding eugenics in Ontario, Alberta, and Canada, as it has helped shape my research into what will, hopefully, be a major research project worthy of a degree. Although I have used quite a number of sources, for the purpose of this presentation, I narrowed it down to 3 of the most important books that I have used. So the first is Angus MacLaren's Our Own Master Race, Eugenics in Canada, 1885 to 1945, published in 1990. MacLaren's work is the most widely used and most referenced source on the history of eugenics in Canada. It follows a relatively chronological timeline that breaks down the history of eugenics in Canada while referencing important individuals, organizations, and groups in the eugenics movement. The next book focuses entirely on Ontario. C. Elizabeth Coaster's In the Public Good, Eugenics and Law in Ontario is a very recent book that was published in 2021. It examines 3 different legal processes that were used to advance eugenic ideals in Ontario between 1910 and 1938. These include legislative bills, provincial royal commissions, and criminal trials. Coaster's work is one of the first books focused solely on eugenics in Ontario, and in it, she believes that eugenics must be discussed outside of the framework of the law, or much of the activity that occurred outside the law will be missed. The last of the three works that I want to make note of is Erica Dick's Facing Eugenics, Reproduction, Sterilization, and the Politics of Choice from 2013. Dick's book focuses on eugenics in Alberta, making it a good choice when compared next to coasters. It examines the social history of sexual sterilizations and the politics of reproduction in Alberta. It also discusses how eugenics programs shaped the idea of a healthy morale and the discourse on reproduction in Alberta. So I've had an interest in learning about eugenics for some time. I did a research project for a course called Issues in Canadian History in the 4th year of my undergrad, which set the stage for what I would write about for my master's. With that in mind, I then had to narrow down my topic to something important, interesting, and something that I myself wanted to learn more about. After looking at sources such as the three I showed you, I realized there wasn't really anything comparing Alberta and Ontario. They seem like an unlikely pairing, but in fact, when comparing the two of them, and more specifically comparing two eugenic bodies within them, revealed more than I expected. My research aims to add something new to the discussion on eugenics in Canada. I wanted to understand what kind of environment was needed to create a eugenic organization that could be so efficient in a sterilization program, and what environment could prevent another eugenic organization from doing the same thing. My research primarily focuses on the Eugenics Society of Canada, which focuses mainly on Ontario, and the Alberta Eugenics Board. I'm looking at their structure, beliefs, organization, and key policies. But I will also be going beyond the organizations themselves to look at key individuals and key organizations that supported both groups, the influence of popular media, and answering questions like why was Alberta able to pass eugenic legislation, and why Ontario and the Eugenics Society of Canada were not able to. Lastly, I wanted to determine if sterilizations occurred in Ontario despite the lack of legislation. In doing so, I hope to show everyone here how important the topic of eugenics in Canada is and why it is necessary to look at provinces that enacted legislation in comparison to provinces that did not, to understand the inner workings of the eugenics movement in Canada. So before we get into everything, I want to talk briefly about what eugenics is itself and what it looked like in Canada before the creation of the Eugenics Society and the Alberta Board. So the term eugenics was coined in 1883 by Francis Galton, and it refers to the idea that human biology can be improved through the selective reproduction of those deemed the fittest members of society. Eugenics can also be divided into two subcategories: positive eugenics, or the promotion of desirable traits, and negative eugenics, the removal of undesired traits. Eugenics is probably best known now in relation to the Second World War and Nazi Germany, but the idea, to a lesser but still important degree, was prevalent in Canada as well. Early eugenicists at the beginning of the 20th century were influenced by what they perceived as the two main threats to Canadian health: the reproduction of the unfit in Canada and the immigration of the unfit to Canada. Many of those deemed feeble-minded or mentally defective were segregated in institutions away from the rest of society, but eugenicists believed that it was too expensive and that sterilization would be the cheaper, more effective, and interestingly, the more humane method of restriction. The ultimate goal was to control those deemed unfit and hold power over their reproductive autonomy. One way that could occur is if sterilization laws were implemented provincially, allowing the government to control or establish groups to facilitate sterilization programs. That is where the Eugenics Society and the Alberta Board come into play. However, they played two different roles, despite having the same belief in the eugenics movement. So let's begin with the Eugenics Society of Canada, or ESC for short. The group was created in 1930 by Dr. William Hutton. Dr. Hutton was a physician and medical officer of health from Toronto. He also served as the Society's first president. The ESC was not particularly a large group, never having more than about 100 members, and mainly consisted of academics, medical professionals, and welfare workers. The executive committee of the ESC was composed of Dr. Hutton, A.R. Kaufman, a wealthy rubber manufacturer and treasurer of the ESC, and D.B. Harkness, a welfare expert and magistrate. The Society's primary objective was to persuade the provincial government to implement sterilization legislation. They also wanted to execute an educational program of racial betterment. The group publicly declared that, quote unquote, biological taint was the single most important cause of the nation's social problems. Believing this, the goal was to mirror The goal was to mirror organizations like the Alberta Eugenics Board and implement sterilization laws like those seen in Germany and California at the time. Outside of sterilization laws, the ESC also wanted to limit immigration, continue the segregation of the feeble-minded, and change the Marriage Act to prevent the union of the feeble-minded or those believed to be idiots and imbeciles. Despite the heavy-set beliefs, the ESC was never able to persuade the government or rally enough support in Ontario to pass sterilization legislation. Now, on the other hand, Alberta was able to enact the Alberta Sexual Sterilization Act in 1928 under the United Farmers of Alberta government. The act included a section that established a 4-person board to facilitate the sterilization program that would emerge from the act. Thus, the Alberta Eugenics Board, or AEB for short, was established. The 4 original members consisted of 2 medical practitioners nominated by the Senate of the University of Alberta and the Council of the College of Physicians, and 2 members appointed by the Lieutenant Governor and Council. The 4 individuals chosen are the 4 you see on screen from left to right: Dr. George Mason, Miss Jean Fields, Dr. John McEachran, and Dr. Edgerton Pope. The board's objective was to oversee the sterilization program on a case-by-case basis and decide whether or not to approve individuals presented to the board for sterilization. Each case seen by the board was reviewed for only approximately 13 minutes, and meetings on average saw and discussed 13 cases. Interestingly, over the 43 years that the board existed, only 19 members served, as most stayed on the board until their death. So the AEB's beliefs are reflected directly in the legislation it emerged from and the legislation that it continued to pass. So for the AEB, the focus shifts from beliefs to the details of the legislation itself. The Sexual Sterilization Act of 1928 emerged out of the wider eugenics movement in Alberta that argued for the improved breeding to remove the issues of humanity. It was passed in legislation on the 21st of March, 1928. In a nutshell, the Act allowed sexual sterilizations to occur under specific parameters, mainly consent from the individual, spouse or guardian, or a provincial minister. However, the language in the Act was vague and did not specify who was considered unfit, giving the AEB significant power in choosing. In 1937, the Act was amended to add the terms mentally defective person and psychotic person to the list of those eligible for sterilization. In adding those definitions, the Act changed the parameters of consent, and from then on allowed individuals to be approved for sterilization without consent if they were labeled mentally defective or psychotic. This allowed the board to increase the amount of people they could sterilize. This had devastating effects on many minority groups, especially Indigenous peoples in Canada. After the 1937 amendment, the rates of Indigenous sterilization tripled, as they were more likely to be determined or deemed mentally defective because the test that determined the IQ was based on Western European knowledge. The last amendment came in 1942. It added neurosyphilis, epilepsy, and Huntington's chorea as conditions that could be grounds for sterilization. It also allowed the Minister of Health to easily replace a member of the AEB if they were absent, so sterilization decisions could still occur. By the time the Act was repealed in 1972, 4,739 individuals were recommended for sterilizations by the board, and ultimately 2,834 people were sterilized. I wanted to transition to the next level of comparison, a comparison of supporters, both individual and organizations. To begin, I'm going to focus on a few influential people that supported the ESC and the eugenics movement in Ontario. So the first name on my list is Dr. Clarence Hinks. He was a Canadian physician and the founder of the Canadian National Committee for Mental Hygiene, which later became, and is still known as today, the Canadian Mental Health Association. He was an avid eugenicist and believed that so-called mentally defectives were the root of society's problems. He also did research on the feeble-minded in Alberta that reported a recommendation for sterilization programs. His work was of great influence to the ESC. Next is Dr. Clarence B. Farrer. Farrer was a Canadian psychiatrist, the first director of the Toronto Psychiatric Hospital, and editor of the American Journal of Psychology. He was a member of the ESC and advocated extensively for sterilizations in Ontario, believing that mental illness was hereditary. He, alongside Hincks, also lobbied for the Sexual Sterilization Act in Alberta and praised the West for their achievement. Madge Thurlow-Macklin is the next individual I want to discuss. She was an American geneticist who moved to Canada to teach at the University of Western Ontario. In Ontario, she was the most important scientific defender of eugenics. She argued heredity was an important element of various diseases such as tuberculosis, cancer, and diabetes, to name a few, and believed that reproduction was the main source of Canada's ills. She gave her full support to the ESC and campaigned for sterilizations in their favor. The last, and arguably one of the most influential eugenics supporters in Ontario, is Dr. Helen McMurky. She was a physician that later became the Special Inspector of the Feeble-Minded in Ontario from 1906 to 1919. This role allowed her to become the pioneering supporter for eugenics and later the ESC. She completed reports on the feeble-minded, concluding that, quote-unquote, personal inadequacies underlay much of the nation's ill health. In 1920, she became the chief of the Division of Maternal and Child Welfare for the Department of Health. Now, in Alberta, much of the same sentiments and beliefs were seen. However, the supporters in Alberta were more directly tied to the eugenics movement in terms of their connection to government organizations and eugenic institutions. I'll begin with Richard G. Reid. So Reid was a Canadian politician who served as the Minister of Health for Alberta from 1921 to 1923, and then as Premier of Alberta from 1934 to 1935 under the United Farmers of Alberta, a group I'll be talking about a little later. It was Reid who proposed the idea of developing a program of eugenic sterilization in the province in 1922. His proposal clearly turned heads, as the act was passed a mere 6 years later. Next is Dr. Leonard J. Levan, an American-born physician and medical researcher that became the medical superintendent at the Red Deer Provincial Training School in 1949. The school, for context, was one of the locations in which individuals, especially children, were sent and later, in many cases, approved for sterilizations. Levan played a key role in that process, advocating for sterilizations and often being the one to personally choose patients he believed should be seen by the board. He also regularly attended board meetings when they took place at the school. Margaret Gunn was another influential eugenics supporter. She was the first vice president of the United Farm Women of Alberta, another prominent Alberta group that will be highlighted later. She became president in 1924, and during her time as president, the Sexual Sterilization Act was passed. While it was under the United Farmers of Alberta that the act was passed, the United Farm Women of Alberta were extremely influential in promoting and drafting the act. She was a member of the AEB, and so was her husband, R.B. Gunn. In her provincial address, she stated her beliefs clearly, that she wished for, quote-unquote, racial betterment through the weeding out of undesirable strains. The last two individual supporters I want to discuss are William Aberhart and Ernest Manning. Aberhart and his successor Manning were leaders of the Social Credit Party, the party that defeated the UFA in 1935. They were fundamentalists and eugenics supporters that believed in sterilizations. They created a province in which politics and religion overlapped, meaning active opposition to eugenics had virtually no place. They also ran the province in a more authoritarian manner, expecting unquestioning loyalty. Due to their power and support for sterilizations, the AEB was able to continue and increase in power, even after a change in government. So next on the list of important comparisons between the ESC and the AEB are the key organizations supporting both groups and the eugenics movement in general. In Ontario, while there were a decent amount of minor groups that supported the ESC, like organizations of various doctors, the main support came from two organizations, the Parents Information Bureau and the Canadian National Committee for Mental Hygiene, which I'm going to refer to as the Committee for Mental Hygiene to hopefully avoid a tongue twist. So the Parent Information Bureau was established by the treasurer of the ESC, A.R. Kaufman, the man on the screen. The Bureau was a clinic for family planning and birth control and was monumental in the birth control movement in Ontario. So monumental that Kaufman was given the nickname Canada's Mr. Birth Control. The Bureau advocated heavily for sterilizations in Ontario and tried to persuade the government to consider enacting a sterilization law. They also distributed pamphlets explaining sterilization's benefits to the public in attempts to change public perception, which is quite hypocritical if you ask me. So the Committee for Mental Hygiene similarly aided the ESC in attempting to persuade public opinion. While the committee's work began before the establishment of the ESC, it both helped it when it was operational and set the stage for the emergence of the ESC. The committee organized travel exhibits to show the public the dangers of the feeble-minded. The photo you see on screen is a poster that was created by the Committee for Mental Hygiene that demonstrates the so-called 4 types of mental deficiencies. These kinds of images were used to show the public the necessity of the eugenics movement. In Alberta, the organizations that supported the AEB and the eugenics movement were larger in number to that of Ontario and heavily intertwined in the eugenics movement. I have already mentioned both the United Farmers of Alberta and the United Farm Women of Alberta, so I'll begin with those two. So the United Farmers of Alberta, or UFA, were an association of Alberta farmers that has acted as both a political party and a lobbyist group. Under their leadership, the Sexual Sterilization Act was passed as they were in power from 1921 to 1935. Outside of the act, they advocated for eugenics and sterilizations to solve societal problems and implemented sterilization as part of their new healthcare system. The United Farm Women of Alberta, or UFWA, were an auxiliary to the UFA. They were the first provincial organization of farm women in Alberta. The UFWA influenced the UFA and were instrumental in passing the Sexual Sterilization Act. They believed sterilization could protect the people of Alberta, as society was deteriorating due to the loss of desirable genes overseas during the First World War. The group also had considerable support from the Albertan public, which contained a large number of women and other women's groups. So following the UFA, the Alberta Social Credit Party came into power in Alberta. They maintained power from 1935 until 1971. The group was a radical populist party that capitalized on anti-Eastern Canada sentiment and focused on an isolated mentality. On top of this, the Social Credit Party believed in sterilizations and the work of the AEB, and allowed them to continue and grow in their work. It was under the Social Credit Party that the 2 amendments to the Act were passed. Now, the Famous Five is the last group I want to mention that supported the AEB and the eugenics movement in Alberta. Known for their work in the first wave feminist movement and the infamous Persons case, the Famous Five were also avid eugenicists, composed of Nellie McClung, Emily Murphy, Irene Parlby, Louise McKinney, and Henrietta Edwards. They were instrumental in spreading eugenic ideologies and campaigning for the adoption of eugenic practices. The main members involved were Parlby, McClung, and Murphy. Parlby was the president of the UFWA, which we now know has direct ties to the AEB. McClung campaigned for sterilization heavily, and in focusing on maternal feminism, wrote works that describe who was a fit mother and who was not. Murphy was the first female magistrate of the British Empire, and used her power to campaign for eugenics and sterilization. To some extent, the act was passed due to her campaigning and the subsequent rise in public interest and favorable public opinion. Now, in terms of public sentiment, outside of the influence of key individuals and organizations, much of the support from eugenics came from the influence of popular culture. Much of the popular culture surrounding eugenics in Canada was widespread, meaning more often than not, the populations of both Ontario and Alberta were subject to the same media. For example, influential books like Helen McMurky's The Almosts and Nellie McClung's In Times Like These, which are the first 2, provide the public with eugenic sentiments. The Almosts, which created a wide audience to eugenics in the 1920s, argued that the feeble-minded were easily influenced, which could lead to criminal activity. McMurky essentially paints her eugenic ideologies as helping the feeble-minded, as she connects literature and uses that literature to show how she feels they should be helped. However, her darker ideologies are hidden in her writing, which was an easy way to persuade the public by showing them that they could help instead of scaring them. McClung's In Times Like These, published in 1915, is considered the best book for understanding maternal feminism at the time. The book was influential in Canada, the US, and Britain. This book reveals her eugenic ideologies as it describes the preservation of the Anglo-Saxon race and the concerns over the allowance of the unfit to reproduce. While it is shaped on the idea of maternal feminism, McClung's main topic of discussion, a subcategory within maternal feminism, is also there, which is the notion of bettering the race, and In Times Like These discusses that eugenic ideology in the way McClung portrays a good and a bad mother. The other main piece of popular culture I want to discuss is a radio series on CBC Radio that was sponsored by the ESC and broadcast across Canada. The Future of the Race, a series of radio addresses, was a collection of 8 addresses that ran from October 4th to November 22nd of 1938 and discussed the widespread eugenics movement and used the discussion to provide proof of its significance and reasoning for its support. The addresses focused on the concepts of survival of the fittest, the issues of overpopulation, the German population policies, and the California sterilization laws. The last 2 addresses, presented by Dr. Hutton himself, discussed the idea of preventative medicine to protect children and ensure the future generations are safe from feeble-mindedness. Hutton believed that, quote unquote, the future of Canada depends on the quality of its manhood. The radio series instilled in the population that the goal was to attack the problem before it happened, and the way to achieve that was sterilization laws. So taking a few steps back, it is also important to understand why the AEB was able to be so effective in their sterilization policy. The most obvious answer is that the AEB was created directly out of a sterilization law. So the board did not have to push for sterilization laws as they were already created. However, the reasoning goes beyond that. The main factors that allowed Alberta to enact and pursue a sterilization program facilitated by the AEB are religion, government control, immigration beliefs, and the position of Alberta itself. In terms of religion, Catholic opposition, arguably the biggest form of opposition to sterilization in Canada, was not widespread. In fact, the Roman Catholic Church was relatively weak in Alberta, as the Protestant Church was more prominent. The only notable opposition came in the form of letters from members and the clergy of the church, but they did not have enough support. Because of the direct tie between the government, the eugenics movement, and the AEB, the sterilization program flourished in Alberta. Both the UFA and the Social Credit Party actively supported the eugenics movement and passed sterilization laws. The government was also filled with charismatic leaders that had a small number of medical professionals supporting them. Because of the medical professionals' connection with the government, they were easily trusted and relied on. The government also had stability, with it only transitioning once in the multi-decade sterilization program's run. The government was also heavily involved in the anti-immigration movement in the West. The Sexual Sterilization Act represents one response to the growing number of immigrants in the Canadian West, as many of the targets for sterilization were immigrants themselves. Although feeble-mindedness could be found in those with British descent, it was more commonly found in non-British individuals. And lastly, the province of Alberta itself created a climate that allowed the AEB and the sterilization program to thrive. Because Alberta was a relatively new province and had strong agricultural roots, eugenic ideas were met with enthusiasm, as most of the population had experience with agricultural selective breeding programs. Another element to this is that the most powerful organizations, like the UFA and the UFWA, were agrarian in nature, meaning that the majority of the population connected with them and felt as though the groups represented the wider population, making it easier for organizations to push their beliefs on the public with little resistance. In Ontario, the factors that helped further the eugenics movement in Alberta and subsequently the work of the AEB were not present. There are a few factors that played an important role in the reason why the ESC was never able to pass eugenic legislation. Unlike Alberta, Ontario contained large metropolitan areas and may have had a more educated population due to the progressive nature of the province. The government was also never particularly keen on entertaining the idea of sterilization. The Ontario Liberal Party was specifically concerned with jeopardizing the support from Catholic voters. The Catholic Church, specifically the Roman Catholic Church's opposition to sterilization, is vital to understanding the lack of legislation in Ontario. Ontario's Catholic population was far more substantial than Alberta's, which put up little resistance in Western provinces, partly due to the factors that helped the implementation of sterilization that I mentioned in the previous slide. In Ontario, however, the power of the church was far more prominent. The Catholic Church actively condemned birth control and abortion, as it went against the fundamental and traditional roles for the sexes. In condemning birth control, they also condemned sexual sterilizations. The Catholic Church also condemned several high-ranking members of the ESC for their sterilization advocacy. This is not to say, though, that the Church completely opposed eugenics, as they believed in segregation of the feeble-minded, but interfering with reproduction, which sterilization completely eliminates, was actively advised against. With the power of the Catholic Church, sterilization was never passed in Ontario. Angus McLaren sums it up perfectly. He says that, quote unquote, sterilization legislation was passed in the Western provinces where Catholicism was weakest. It would not be in the Eastern provinces where the church was strong. So one of the big questions I thought to myself before starting research on this subject was if official legislation was the only way in which sterilizations occurred in Canada. I quickly realized that legislation only allowed sterilizations to occur legally, and that a lack of sterilization did not prevent sterilizations from occurring. In Ontario, sterilizations occurred quietly in hospitals, especially on women, because sterilizations could be hidden easily under the guise of hospital-based gynecological procedures. Sterilization interests were actually a driving force in most birth control initiatives. In order to explain an example of this, I'm going to turn your attention back to A.R. Kaufman. Kaufman himself was responsible for numerous sterilizations. As a rubber manufacturer, he employed many workers, often in lower classes. He claims to have arranged for 435 sterilization in his rubber plants in a so-called sick room. He also, with the Parent Information Bureau, supposedly assisted in 1,100 sterilizations. In a letter from him to the president of the board of directors for the Women's College Hospital, he states that in some cases, he would offer to pay all the expenses involved in arranging sterilizations. In another aspect to the birth control movement, some women, mainly white middle-class women, requested sterilizations as a means of birth control. However, voluntary sterilizations, like coerced, were questionable under the criminal code. So the procedures had to be hidden from the public view. Voluntary sterilizations like this also occurred in Alberta. However, to be clear, there were two kinds of voluntary sterilizations, those that were truly voluntary and those that were persuaded to agree voluntarily. Now, much of the discussion on eugenics in Ontario and the ESC mainly focuses on Southern Ontario as it was the home base, so to speak, for the ESC. Although outside of the scope of my MRP, I wanted to do some research to see if there was any eugenic activity in Northwestern Ontario, especially in the Thunder Bay region where I was born and raised. The one mention of Northwestern Ontario that I came across was from McLaren's Our Own Master Race, one of my main points of reference. In it, McLaren mentions Port Arthur as a municipal government that, by 1937, actually backed the idea of sexual sterilizations in Ontario. He also mentions a Lieutenant Colonel Charles N. Laurie, a medical officer of health from Port Arthur that supported the eugenics movement. He was a prominent physician in Port Arthur, aiding in the various diphtheria and typhoid outbreaks in the early 1900s. However, he also believed in sterilizations and eugenics. McLaren revealed a quote from the Toronto Star in an interview with Dr. Laurie that reads as follows: "If the method of the survival of the fittest could be started, he would not be surprised if every beggar in the world would soon be exterminated." Clearly, some of Laurie's beliefs fall in line with that of the eugenics movement, and in turn shows that eugenics was not just confined to Southern Ontario. So the last important comparison between the ESC and the AEB is their downfalls. In Ontario, opposition to eugenics occurred most heavily in the 1930s. Due to the threat of opposition, Dr. Hutton approached Harold Kirby, the Ontario Minister of Health at the time, with a proposed amendment to the Medical Act that would make sterilization legal while leaving out the question of applicability on the individual surgeon. In this approach, the ESC referenced the advances of Nazi Germany. As you may be able to conclude, the proposal did not see the light of day. However, this was not actually the nail in the coffin. While the reasons the ESC was never able to pass eugenic legislation also coincide directly with the reasons behind its downfall, it was actually an out-of-pocket housing scheme that ultimately ended the ESC. During the Second World War, the ESC created a housing scheme to provide housing for the finest children from the motherland. That, however, did not even include every British citizen fleeing the war. Even though 190,000 British children were trying to evacuate, the ESC only wanted to protect the cream of British children. Here, they were still holding true to racial betterment, despite the public knowledge of the horrors of the Nazi regime. With that sentiment in the public, the ESC was consistently compared to the Nazi Party, causing its influence to begin to decline and ultimately sealed the fate of the ESC. Now, the AEB's decline and eventual downfall has similar characteristics to the downfall of the ESC. Support for sexual sterilizations began to decline when the revelations of the Nazi activity in the context of eugenics emerged in Canada. However, it did not lead to the collapse of the AEB. Eugenics as a science was also being discredited by scientists who were advancing in the field of genetics. In the latter half of the 20th century, there was also a change in public sentiment on reproductive rights, and there was a bigger push for individual and patient rights. However, it was not until 1971 that the AEB saw its inevitable end. In 1971, Alberta elected a new progressive conservative government headed by Premier Peter Lakehead. Lakehead had a strong commitment to individual rights and requested from his staff that any legislature that goes directly against human rights be brought to his attention. I bet you can guess which legislation was brought to his attention. In 1972, the Sexual Sterilization Act was repealed by Lakehead's government, finally criminalizing sterilizations after 44 years. With the end of the Sexual Sterilization Act came the dissolvement of the AEB, and the end of the sexual sterilization program facilitated by the AEB that left over 2,800 people sterilized, many without their knowledge, only to discover the truth later in life. Now, before I give the floor over to Christine, I would like to thank everyone for coming out tonight to listen to both Christine and I's presentations. I would also like to thank both the museum for inviting us to speak and my advisors, Dr. Stevenson and Dr. Beaulieu, for helping me shape my research into what it is today. Detailed research on eugenics is a more recent discussion in the context of Canadian history, and my goal is to further that discussion and help explain why certain provinces' eugenics movements were shaped the way they were, with or without official legislation. I hope that I was able to show everyone here a small piece of the darker side of Canadian history, one that is often omitted from curriculum and textbooks. It is those kinds of histories that, at least in my opinion, prove to be some of the most important. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Haileigh. What a fascinating set of research and such important work. So thank you again for presenting that tonight. Our next speaker is Christine Green, and she'll be presenting Constructing a Collective Past, Locating Indigenous Histories in Local Narratives. Christine is an MA student at Lakehead University and is completing her thesis on Indigenous representation in community museums in Northwestern Ontario. She has worked in several community and specialized museums. She also works as a high school teacher for both the Superior Greenstone and Lakehead Public School Boards. So, Christine.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for coming, first of all. And thank you to Haileigh. You did a fantastic job. Super interesting. And I'm glad I actually got to hear about your research. We don't always get to hear about each other's research in the grad office. So it's nice that I was able to actually hear somebody else. So my research is slightly different than Haileigh's in that I took a focus on public history. So public history is more about how history is presented to the public. So it can include anything from teaching, which is great for knowing that. Curriculum could use some work, but that's not the point of this. To museums, to just really any way you interact with history. Even those small little Ontario plaques are considered public history. So it's a very broad field, and that can make it very interesting to try and figure out who's saying what and who we should listen to. So I'm hoping you'd like to listen to me. But if not, that's okay. You're kind of stuck here. So the first thing is I'm going to tell you what I define Northwestern Ontario as, because everybody in this room probably knows there's a lot of debates. Those of you at home, if you're not from this region, there's a lot of debate about who assumes where that kind of line is. So what I did is I took the Rainy River District, the Kenora District, and the Thunder Bay District, which is also the defined Northwest Ontario from the OMA, the Ontario Museum Association, so that it's more usable for actual museums as well, so that those that are defined as Northwest fall within the Northwest section of my presentation and my research. I also defined community museum based on the OMA's definition of it, because otherwise I'm going to have a lot of really small museums that don't meet the minimum requirements of a community museum within Ontario. And so that did exclude a lot of historical societies, archives, or small little just stop on the side of the road kind of museums. It also eliminated living histories and things like that. So there is still further research to be done, but I only get so many pages to write. So the other big thing that I need to define before I can start is how we're defining Indigenous. So if I go the government way, we have status and non-status, which I'm not doing. Government doesn't get to define it for me or for this research. So it includes anybody that identifies as First Nation, Métis, Inuit, or any other form of Indigenous within Canada. So there's a lot of people there, but it is important to look at all of those. My main areas are going to be First Nation and Métis because there is not a strong Inuit population in Northwestern Ontario. So there's kind of 4 big measuring sticks that I looked at. So in 1994, the Task Force on Museums and First Peoples came out. They did a whole big task force, and then they came out with a report. And one of the main things they asked for was interpretation or representation of information relating to First Peoples should conform to an ethic of responsibility to the community represented, as well as to the scholarly or professional ethics of the academic and museum communities, which basically means you should represent people the way they want to be represented, but also based on museum guidelines and the ethics put forth by the Canadian Museum Association, Ontario Museum Association, and all of the scholars that work within public history. The second thing came out in 2015, and it's a big thing that's been going on since then, and that's the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So the call to action that was most important in this research was that they called upon the federal government to provide funding to the Canadian Museum Association to undertake, in collaboration with Aboriginal peoples, a national review of museum policies and best practices to determine the level of compliance with the United Nations declarations on the rights of Indigenous peoples and to make recommendations. One thing I've learned while working in community museums across Ontario is when the CMA does things like that, they do tend to focus on bigger museums because there are so many museums across Canada that are smaller. So the CMA did do a survey, which was fantastic. I'm not going to discuss their results very much because I am trying to stay within the time frame. And their results were, there was a strong data analysis component that goes along with that. And that's my math love, but not everybody likes that. So what I did is I went through the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, and I pulled out the 2 articles that best kind of represented what we were looking at. So Article 15.1 says that Indigenous peoples have the right to have their cultures, traditions, and histories appropriately represented in education and public information. So I took that to mean museums as well, because it is public education, and also because I wanted to. The other one is Article 11.1, which says that Indigenous peoples should have the right to practice and revitalize their cultural traditions and customs, including protecting and developing the past, present, and future manifestations of their cultures, such as archaeological sites, historical sites, and artifacts. So I didn't do a big look behind the curtains because that would be way over my page limit. So something I get to do later or somebody else can take up. But those are the big things that I'm looking at when I'm looking at these museums. To talk about my findings, before I can really talk about everything that I found, I had to make sure that all of the things I was looking at actually fell under the mission statements and the values that these museums were working off of, because that is going to be the biggest constraint museums see when it comes to what they can do. Almost every museum said that they would like to engage the community and make sure that they are engaging the community in active and truthful ways. They want to strengthen relationships with the community, and they also want to record, document, and represent the community, district, or their region's history. This is a very narrowed down kind of overview of it. Each museum had their own mission statement and values that they had to go by. But this is a general concept. And by saying that they want to record, document, and represent the community, if there's an Indigenous community or Indigenous peoples within that history, it should be represented. First thing I looked at was exhibits. And so each of the institutions actually presented Indigenous histories in at least some way. To start off, that was actually a very big victory because I've seen it, some museums that have none and some that have a lot. So when I went in, I was hoping everybody had at least something, and they did. So that was a very nice discovery to find. Most of the material regarding Indigenous groups in the permanent exhibits was focused on the contact to the fur trade era. So pre-contact was sometimes addressed, but very few of the museums provided information on the post-fur trade era. So almost every museum, they had either a pre-contact or they started at contact and they went through the fur trade and then it just stopped. And there was no Indigenous history past that. We didn't mention Indigenous people. There was nothing. And that became very concerning because Indigenous people still exist, but we've now relegated them to fur trade and before, which is a problematic stereotype that exists in a lot of colonial nations. And with that colonial narrative happening that Indigenous people don't exist, it is required to do that in order to successfully finish colonization. So by erasing the history of Indigenous people, we now can claim the land, which Indigenous people are still here. And their histories are still very relevant. So within the permanent exhibits, there was, as I said, limited outside contact to the fur trade. But when we had pre-contact, there was often not accurate dates, mostly because it was done before the new research came out, because new archaeological sites have been found that have presented information saying that we have had Indigenous people in this exact region farther back than we had seen before. So, and it was also usually vague. They're usually only discussed that they were there, and there was nothing about cultures or trade or anything like that, which is important when we're talking about it. You can't just say, I am here. History is more than that. You need to talk about what was happening, what were the interactions, things like that. So, when Indigenous people are presented at contact and during the fur trade, it is not presented from the perspective of an equal meeting. It is presented as Indigenous people are kind of off in this corner and we're over here making contact and doing the fur trade and doing all of that. It's like the Indigenous people are that nice little piano over there and we're over here. Fur trade's all us. They just kind of bring us stuff every once in a while. They might pop up, but they're not the main actors in the story. Another big piece that was missing was Métis people. I very rarely saw them at all. There was very little representation of Métis people, their history, and their strength in the region, which is a huge part of our region's history. The Métis played a huge role, especially because we are closer to the Red River settlement than we are to Toronto. So as we look at that, the Métis people had a stronger influence when we're going through the histories. So many museums tried to cover this gap in their permanent exhibits, and they tried very hard, and I appreciate that. And they were trying to cover this gap through temporary exhibits. And they, for example, the Thunder Bay Museum here brought in the Lost Generation. They're including Anishinaabe-Moan, the Ojibwe language, in their Wendell Beckwith exhibit. So they are trying. They are trying to fill these gaps. And we'll talk about the issues they're facing a little later on. So the next thing I looked at was programming. Programming is a very uncommon thing for formal. The Thunder Bay Museum actually has the biggest bandwidth of formal programming in the region, mostly because it's also the largest city center. But that formal programming can kind of be broken into two different sections. So children's programming, it's when the kids come to the museum or the museum brings activities to them. And it is typically very focused on early settler societies and Canadian history, but that history lacks Indigenous components. There is a lot of different ways that this can be presented, and Canadian history with regard to Indigenous history can be a very dark background. So I'm not saying that we have to teach them in grade 1 that residential schools happened and everything that happened. That I've taught grade 1s, they're not going to understand. It's going to upset them in a way that's not beneficial. But we do need to start introducing Indigenous people as a main actor within the histories that we're presenting to children. And those that did present Indigenous histories were typically presenting in contact, fur trade, or through stereotyped storytelling. So I'm not saying that we can't have storytelling initiatives, but we need to be involving Indigenous people in the dialogue regarding that. We can't just take stories off the internet and then read them to children and say, this is Indigenous culture. So these programs typically are aimed at young elementary kids, so up to about grade 3. Sometimes you'll push to grade 4 or 5. The other section of programming that you can get is adult-focused programming, which all of you are conveniently here for adult-focused programming. So it really depends on speakers that can come in, networks that these museums have, and the research and understanding of the region of other people or of the curators and exhibit planners and our various staff that exist at museums, how they are able to present information, how much time they have. So when Indigenous histories were presented, they were very in-depth. They were fantastically done, but it was typically related to the present, to temporary or traveling exhibits. So there was no kind of guaranteed Indigenous histories available or histories that included Indigenous people. So for publications, marketing, and outreach, as many of these museums are very small, there was very little publications or outreach or marketing. The biggest well of things I found was actually here at the museum. I love this museum. I've worked here. Unfortunately, in a lot of the publications, there's not a lot of Indigenous histories. And that's because of the availability of material that people are writing about. It's not necessarily about the museum itself. Sometimes it's about what's available to them to produce. When outreach happens, it's often centered around exhibits and holidays. So you're going to get a lot of Christmas and Easter and things like that, and not as many Indigenous celebrations, though most of them did do major outreach for Truth and Reconciliation Day. So that was a very good step in the right direction and good attempts at starting to move through that reconciliation process. And marketing was typically focused on exhibits and thus did show more Indigenous representation because of the use of traveling exhibits to try and fill the holes in the permanent exhibits. What I want to highlight here is that museums do want to change. They are making changes since the Truth and Reconciliation Commission came out. So as I've mentioned, they are using temporary exhibits. They are trying to fill in those gaps, but they're also creating Indigenous advisory boards and committees. They are trying to build relationships with nearby communities, and they are trying to increase Indigenous access to collections, all of which are part of the UNDRIP articles. Now, I'm sure you're not very surprised after all of that for me to say, as of right now, Northwestern Ontario community museums don't comply with the UNDRIP articles in their entirety. But again, there is a desire for change, and that is a very good start. This is especially problematic right now, though, because Bill C-15 that was passed after the Truth and Reconciliation Commission requires the federal government to prepare an action plan to achieve the objectives of UNDRIP by June 21st of this year. So we don't know as of yet what that plan is. And that becomes very important in seeing because that's also going to impact how museums are able to move forward. There are a couple changes that most museums have said they would like to make. So I went around and I also interviewed as many of the museum professionals in those areas and in those museums that I could. And what they said is they would like to hire more Indigenous staff for collections, programming, outreach, and connection building. They would like to increase the Indigenous community involvement in collections, exhibit design, programming, and other avenues in the museum. They also want to increase Indigenous access to collections and to the institution. They would like for more research on the region to be done, whether it's done by them or by other academics, institutions, things like that. Some of them also mentioned that they would like to completely redo, if they had no restrictions on it, they'd like to completely redo their permanent exhibits to fill in the gaps that have been noticed. But there's problems with that. There are restrictions. So one of the big restrictions, as I'm sure anybody that works in the heritage field knows, is funding and resources. With resources, yes, we need money. We need money for training. We need money for redoing exhibits, everything like that. But it's more than just monetary resources that we need. There are time issues. So a lot of these museums only have one person working there. There's only so much time in the day they have with trying to manage their collections, trying to put up exhibits, take down exhibits, sit through the meetings, go through and plan future exhibits, network with people, trying to get more done. There's only so much time in a day. I don't want to ask them to spend more hours than they can when I don't want to spend more hours at my job that I have to. The next thing is human resources. So again, there's one person, there's only so much they can do. Recreating a permanent exhibit takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of effort, and it takes the dedication of an entire job. You would need at least one person dedicated solely to that. It also takes a lot of time and human resources to build connections, to complete oral histories, to find the information, do the research to fill this in. And then there's also, if people do want to redo collections or exhibits, there's a loss of revenue. And a lot of these museums rely heavily on the revenue of incoming patrons and visitors to be able to maintain the museum. So if you don't have people coming in, you can't afford to make the changes, and it goes back to monetary, and then you can't afford to pay people. So it goes to human, and then you don't have time. If you're doing the exhibit planning, you won't have time to manage your collection. So the resources are a huge, huge issue that these museums face. And honestly, it's going to take a lot to be able to make these changes. We also need access to research materials, whether that be academic or oral histories. So yes, we can do scholarly material. Yes, I can come up and talk about Indigenous histories. Yes, I can tell you about them. But we don't necessarily have the Indigenous perspective, which is a key component in these UNDRIP articles, is they get to tell their story. And that is also what all of the public history scholars are saying we need to do, is it needs to be the Indigenous people that are presenting their story. And the other component is most of our museums have the unfortunate handed down problem of unknown provenance of their artifacts and archival materials. So they don't know where it came from. They don't know who made it. They only know who gave it to them. And that is a problem because you can't say who made it and talk about that history if you just know some dude went to all these areas, and it could be any Indigenous person in the areas, because each of those people are going to have different stories. Each nation has its own history, and each nation has a different way of beading. So if I say Haileigh beaded something when I beaded something, it's not going to be the same history that's being presented. And a lot of this is a result of earlier colonial practices in both recording donations, it's in people donating, things like that. So that's not something necessarily that is the fault of the museums themselves as current. But there is the issue that there needs to be some way for them to figure it out. And that is a problem that I don't know the answer to, because that is well outside the scope of my project. So moving forward, to address these issues, as I mentioned, externally, there needs to be funding. There's more funding that needs to be directed at this issue. So things I would like to see is funding for hiring Indigenous people, funding for changing exhibits and permanent exhibit revamp, collection classification, and honorariums for elders and community members, because a lot of these museums can't afford to do that, and that is proper courtesy in Indigenous culture, is honorariums and such things. And it would be even better if there was funding for positions for the community members, elders, and knowledge keepers to join the museum. I would also like to see funding for program revamp. I'm not so sure how easy that would be, because getting money from the government is typically never a nice or easy task. So there also needs to be guides to available funding designed for work towards the United Nations Declarations for the Rights of Indigenous People. I would also like to see training programs with strong focus on Indigenous communities and Indigenous objects and collections. I would also like to see training programs aimed at Indigenous peoples to help them to bridge the gap of getting into museums, because a lot of people don't have access to the training to be in museums. So having programs specifically aimed at those groups, or even spots specifically held for Indigenous people, would be a good place to start. And these training programs also need to have paid internships or experiences, because not having income when you're working becomes a very large problem if you are on a second career or if you're trying to get started. We also need more Northwestern Ontario historical research, which I think is something that we will be harping on for years and years to come. We are a small region within a big province. Though geographically we're not small, population we're small, and it becomes difficult to attract people to research about Northwestern Ontario. So this may require more funding and incentivization. There are also internal obstacles that these museums face that need to be addressed. So proper citation of Indigenous and community knowledge, including in programming, outreach, and exhibits. There needs to be a clear indication of which Indigenous nation is being addressed and spoken of historically or presently. And this has to be a wherever possible, because we don't always know where something came from. And we also need to ensure the proper use of terminology, including names for nations, communities, clans, and families. So I know I don't present an answer to any of this, and I do apologize. I know some of you came looking for answers, but I don't have one. It has to come from beyond me, but I'm hoping that my research can give us a stepping stone to call out the government for more funding, call out other institutions, and as a leaping spot for other researchers to look at other areas and look at other community museums. And maybe if enough of us do it, we might be able to see if there's a pattern changing or if we're maybe getting better. I do hope we get better. I would also like to quickly thank the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council and the Ontario Graduate Scholarships for funding all of this. It is expensive to travel all across Northwestern Ontario, and I wouldn't have been able to do this research effectively without that funding. So I'm very grateful to that. I'm also thankful to my supervisor, Dr. Michelle Bellew, because he has listened to me rant and rave about my frustrations, and I'm very thankful for that. There's a lot that was being said, both by Haileigh and myself. So it's a lot of information, but I do thank you again for coming. And I thank the museum for hosting us, especially because I am talking about the museum. I very much appreciate that. And they've done a fantastic job of moving forward and doing the best work they can. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Christine. That was fantastic, and it is definitely a time to be humble as a museum and know that it's a time for change. It's a time to think and reflect on what we have been and what we could be. So it's an important time for those things. So Does anyone have any questions for either of our presenters? Don't be shy.
Yeah. I found the presentation about museums exciting because what I hope for is some sort of regional collaboration. I mean, it's the way we've always worked in the North. No one has resources, but the ingenuity and the innovation that's come from that lack of resources has been outstanding. So if there was an opportunity to bring the museums that you visited together, I mean, right away I see a trillion grant, right? I see that right there. And to engage the Indigenous community in the development of setting priorities which would begin the transformation at a realistic level across the board in Northwestern Ontario. I mean, I was just thinking, oh boy, you know,
So
let's get together.
some of the museums actually do have a network, especially those a little bit west of us. I can definitely give Scott the name of that and who I talked to that mentioned that.
Oh, we do participate in the Sunset Country
Oh, yes.
Museum Network. They meet every 6 months, and we talk about common issues and things like that. But again, like you mentioned, it is a challenge because a lot of those institutions they're one person, they're three people, they're small, and there's that level of bandwidth that they can deal with change and issues and redoing policies and those sorts of things. I think one of the other important aspects of that is that some of those institutions they have different governance structures. So there's a lot of those museums they're owned by a municipality, or they're owned by a First Nations council, or we're one of the few private institutions that has some more flexibility to be able to do those sorts of changes in a quick way. So I think some of them have an additional challenge that we don't have.
Absolutely. It's even trying to arrange interviews with each of them did become problematic at times because you get a leak. That's going to be more important than talking to some lady that's just researching you. And I recognize that. I've worked in there. I've had to try and catch leaks and make sure they don't destroy collections. So I took no offense, but it is a constantly changing calendar, and that is a very big issue. And trying to build those community networks when you don't necessarily 100% know your schedule can be very difficult because you don't want to come across as flaky. But if there's a leak or if there's an issue, you definitely need to address that so that you still have an institution. Because damage to artifacts can really hurt an institution. So building those networks and creating that dialogue can be very difficult, especially because the onus has to sit on the museums because we are the ones that have erased Indigenous histories. If that makes sense.
I'm going to go back to shared resources. One of the things that in the smaller communities, Atikokan, Dryden, Manchwash, that has seemed to have worked is shared training opportunities on to the Sunset Country and on the North Shore. I mean, if that would help, everyone has limited resources. How can we work together to begin to share some of the responsibility? I don't know. To pie in the sky, I suppose, but I don't think it has to be.
Your phrasing on that is perfect because that's exactly what I asked in my interview. If pie in the sky, there was no restrictions, what would you change? And a lot of people want to make a lot of changes, and the issues that prevent that are staggering. And it looks like you're looking up a mountain. So museums are trying to take that first step and just keep making the steps. But there does need to be support from the community and from within the institution.
for more questions. Could I invite you both to come up closer to the
Sorry, yeah, I
microphones?
was thinking about that. Yes, sorry. Does anybody else have questions?
Well, I have a comment. We're a not-for-profit group, and naively, we went forward to try to develop a shoreline using First Nations language, whether it be the water, whether it be land formations, Gitchagumi, Nanabiju, and I tell you, it was such a difficult task that we had to give up because we found things like if we find a First Nations name on a map done by a white man in 1869, who's to say that his Indigenous name is correct or not, whether he be an expert, or whatever. We had so many question marks at the end. And the language, dealing with language, Ojibwe, Ojibwe, and so on. And then when we thought that we could maybe put something together, then we thought, well, who would address it and, allow us to put it on the land and do the proper ceremony. So in the end, trying to do reconciliation from a not-for-profit charitable organization position is madly, very, very difficult, and we just gave up. But we're still trying, so I don't know what advice you would give somebody that wants to do something simple and find that you're off the deep end.
So for that, what I would recommend is speaking with the Indigenous nations across. But again, you need honorariums or tobacco or other things in order to bring that forward and honor the knowledge that they're giving you. And trying to use names from colonial maps is super difficult, especially because it is and was a traditionally oral language. So there are some written components that we've seen, like pictographs and hieroglyphics, not hieroglyphics, that's Egypt, but over in Quetico, there's a bunch there. There's some down in Lake Superior Park that some of our elders have actually been able to translate. I'm glad. Everybody gets my knowledge. So there's not a lot of answers I can give you, but the best step and the best recommendation I can ever make is talk to the Indigenous groups, reach out to either the band council or the chief or anything like that. They are likely to want to help you because you are trying to revitalize it, but you have to recognize that they need to have the authority in the naming, in the history, in all of it. We like to take back that authority because that's what we're used to. We're used to being in charge of, okay, this is the information. This is how I'm going to present it. This is how we're going to do it. And that authority has to go to the Indigenous nations, which is actually another thing that I didn't mention in the moving forward that we need to do. The authority does need to be with Indigenous peoples.
Thank you.
I'm helping with this mapping project, and one database I came across was GrassAct. I don't know if you've heard of it. GRASAC. It's a database of different artifacts through different cultural institutions, educational institutions across America in Ontario, and I thought I'd bring that up in case you weren't aware of that.
I wasn't. I really like using a site called Whose Land. They also have an app, and that helps you identify who's lived there, whose traditional territory. You can look at it by city. You can look at it by traditional occupancy. You can look at it by treaty and agreement. So it's really helpful, especially for creating land acknowledgements for anybody that needs to do that. It is very helpful in recognizing that. So thank you. I'm going to look at that, and I'm probably going to go down a rabbit hole today.
GRASAC. GrassAct.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Anybody else? No? Okay, well, thank you.
My question was going to be for Haileigh.
Sure.
So, when you got towards the end of your research, was there anything that you found that was a long-lasting impact of many of these sterilizations? Was there Was there an impact in populations? Was there an impact in demographics trends that was a long-term result of these terrible acts?
Well, I didn't look too much into specifically demographics or anything like that, but I'm sure there are lasting issues. And a lot of it too is specifically with Indigenous people, sterilizations do still exist. There have been reports within the past few years, specifically, I believe in Manitoba, of sterilizations being done on Indigenous women without their consent and without their knowledge. And I think that's one of the big things that came out of this in my research is seeing specifically there's the example of Leilani Muir, who was the first woman to sue the Alberta government and win because she was sterilized when she was at the provincial training school in Red Deer, and she was told that she was having her appendix removed. And then she got out of the school when she was 18, or around that age, I believe. And she went on to live her life. She got married and then she tried to have kids. And she couldn't. And she went to the doctor and they said, unfortunately, your insides are a mess, is what she says in a documentary that I watched. And the doctor basically told her, like, I don't know what happened, but there is no possible way for you to have children. And then she very quickly learned that her time at the training school and her getting her appendix out wasn't at all what she said it was. And the same happened to men as well. It's not just women. So I think there's I'm sure there's generational trauma involved in that as well. And it's just the lasting effects for a lot of individuals who found out later in life that they couldn't have kids because someone decided that they were feeble-minded or they didn't fit into society. And that them having kids would end up being a detriment to society. So there's a lot of individual trauma as well as I'm sure of demographic trauma that extends beyond just the few years that I talked about.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining us tonight, and thank you to both our presenters. So if you've not heard yet, this year's A Taste of History Dinner, a night of women's suffrage, is taking place on April 14th. This year's speaker is Dr. Karen Dubinsky, a professor at the Departments of History and Global Development Studies at Queen's University. Tickets are selling fast. More information can be found at thunderbaymuseum.com and selecting the events button on our menu. Also a reminder that tickets are on sale for this year's classic car raffle, a 1966 Mustang, and tickets can be available are available for purchase online at museumraffle.com with a draw date of August 12th, and there are just a total of 14,833 tickets available. And both of those can also be purchased at our front desk on your way out this evening. And I also wanted to point out to everybody, do look at our upcoming events calendar. On the 23rd of March, we'll be having a soft public launch of our Places and Faces project to document or to do oral history work with seniors during the pandemic. So those little videos will be presented at that time. So that should be an exciting presentation. And then on the 28th of March is our annual general meeting for the society. So if you are a member, please do come out and support us and make some important decisions about the future of the society. As well, on the 28th is our next free public lecture, which will be by Nancy Angus on the Faces and Places project and all of her all the accomplishments of that project. And finally, I'd like to say thank you to Lakehead University's Department of History for the support of our free public lecture series, the Ontario Trillium Foundation, and a big thank you to the museum staff and volunteers, especially Sarah Silvestri and Michael DeJong working the tech over there, as well as Sydney Balouz and Danielle Pichot, who are working the front desk this evening. So please do take advantage of the refreshments in the back tonight and have a great rest of your night. Thank you.